All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is the podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I'm Rico Rutia, here with my co-host, Brian Pfeiffer. This week we have another very special episode of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. This week we get to talk to longtime labor and UAW United Auto Workers activist Frank Hammer. Frank brings it all to the table, everyone. This is a particularly rich episode. Check this out. We cover labor theory, labor history, internationalism, current events. We talk a lot about social movement unionism, the current UAW strike, and President Shawn Fain, the women's emergency brigades from back in the day. We talk about union reform movements like Teamsters for Democratic Union, TDU, and New Directions, which is a movement within the UAW. Now there's a new movement within the UAW, and we talk about the role of art and culture within unions. So we cover a lot of ground in this episode, and we're very thankful to Brother Frank Hammer, who took the time to talk to us and drop so much labor knowledge on us. As always, though, we like to kick things off with a little music, a little culture. This week, we decided to celebrate the UAW's history and share the song Sit Down, a reference to the strike tactic of sitting down at the workplace and stopping production in that manner. That way, the boss can't replace you with scabs while you're on the picket line. Sit-down strikes spread like wildfire in the U.S. in the 1930s. So here's a song honoring those strikes and that era. This is Sit Down as performed by the Manhattan Chorus in 1937. 1937, in the midst of the Great Depression, these brave workers sat down and paralyzed production in the auto industry. Cheers to the sit-down strikers.
Good evening, listeners. Back to We Rise Fighting. Today we're honored to have a working class fighter for a while in Detroit, Michigan. And we have Brother Frank Hammer on the show with us tonight. Welcome, Frank. And for the benefit of our listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about your background real quick and brief, where you're born and raised and how you got involved in labor? And I believe you're past president of a local there. And, just some of that information for our listeners. Thanks.
Wow. So thank you very much to the two of you. So I've been, I actually have a 50-year career now with the UAW. I actually hired into my first GM plant in 1974. I was a radical activist while I was at school at the University of California in Berkeley and the University of Michigan, and turned to working class organizing when I got, to the point of understanding that our problems were with capitalism and what happens to society under capitalism, and that the working class played a very key role in being able to challenge that system. So I became a working class organizer. I did some work in a rubber plant back east. I entered GM at the Chevy Forge plant, which was the kind of plant that had dirt floors, 75% African American, and was described as a plantation. I got laid off there within 7 months, and with the good fortunes of a UAW GM agreement, I got rehired at a Warren plant, originally Chevy Motors, then became Hydromatic, then became Powertrain. I worked production and skilled trades there, and initiated a caucus known by our newsletter, Straight Talk. And over a period of time, I got elected to bargaining chair representing about 3,500 workers, and also president of the local, and another term as chair. I left the plant after 20 years and worked for the International Union for the last 11 years, 6 on staff, and retired at the end of 2006. And my activism kept right on going, and I've been active in the labor movement here in Detroit and internationally, and with UAW, of course, ever since.
Okay, Frank. I caught something that you mentioned. You mentioned that you were doing working class organizing, and I don't know if I'm reading too much into that, but could you speak to that a little bit? Because, I guess to me it's just a distinction from union organizing. Is there more to that you can speak of? So that's my first question. And my second question is, yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about any of the internationalist work you did, that would be cool too. So,
Okay. So, like while I was on campus at U of M, there were students that were joining the picket lines at a Chrysler plant in Detroit. And that was well before I actually joined, became a factory worker. So we were oriented in doing that working class organizing. And even when I went to Boston, I worked for an outfit called Urban Planning Aid, which was probably the last OEO funded thing under Lyndon Baines Johnson. And even in that capacity, I was helping produce a community newsletter oriented to working class people in the Boston area. So it was there that I actually entered into a rubber factory and began to continue to do working class organizing from the inside, I should say. And then when I came back to Detroit, began in earnest in two GM factories. But of course, it was not just confined to the work in the factories. It was as well outside, trying to build various campaigns in amongst the working class. In terms of the international work, I was born overseas. I was born in Ecuador, and my parents fled Germany and came to Ecuador. That's why I was born there. And so, sort of by nature of my birth, I've had a more internationalist perspective. I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen, but I wasn't born here. And the international work came as a natural outgrowth of my understanding that, U.S. capitalism doesn't confine its excesses within our borders, that it's at the stage of imperialism, which means that it's carrying on its exploitation and oppression way beyond their borders all over the world. That's why we have, estimated 850 military bases around the world to keep securing that system. And we know, with the example of, for example, Mexican workers doing so much of the work for the big three, that the actual national border ought not have very much significance for us, because what binds us together is the fact that we work for the same employers, same manufacturers, and we are, part of a single system of this globalized capital. So it's only natural to reach out across these artificial borders. Specifically, some of that work took me to Colombia. We had a Colombian GM worker who came. It was at one of the labor notes conferences that I met him back in 2012. And I learned of the situation of GM workers there in Bogota who were systematically injured on the job with these onerous, it was an old style auto plant built in 1977. And workers routinely had back injuries, wrist injuries, leg injuries. And the company routinely messed with their medical records and fired them, and they were denied workers' comp, and they were thrown under the bus. And they reached out to U.S. workers, and some of us elected to respond and wage the campaign, like from 2012 till now, on behalf of those fired Colombian workers. And of course, we learned a lot more about the Colombian workers who were still working and involved in a campaign to extend international solidarity as part of that effort. More recently, or in tandem with that, I've also become part of the International Automotive Workers Council, which is based in Germany, and have attended numerous world conferences with that formation. And in fact, the last meeting that we had, which was 2019, we actually met in just outside of Johannesburg in South Africa, bringing together, like about 300 workers and union members and so on from around the world to build international campaigns of solidarity, and that work continues. So that's some of the examples of work that I've done on the international front.
Okay, and there's a lot of stuff happening in labor right now. Here on this podcast, we've covered the labor activism of Starbucks workers, graduate workers, of course the UAW, SAG-AFTRA. This week we could talk about Kaiser Permanente workers going on strike. So there's a lot of stuff happening. And actually, right before we jumped on, Brian forwarded me an article talking about the record amount of workers who were on strike so far this year in comparison to other recent years. Is there anything in particular that inspires you? Is there anything in particular that you think we should watch, or someone who's new to labor should watch? Just anything to highlight of what's going on right now?
Well, I could point to a couple of things. I think that the evolution of my union, the UAW, like I said earlier, I hired in 1974, and I was in the plant or with GM for 32 years. We were part of various movements that were struggling for a class struggle type of unionism, as opposed to the team concept idea of business unionism. But it was really team concept, jointness, and so on. And the evolution in the last few years, especially in the wake of the scandal that gripped the international leadership, including two presidents, all of whom, I think were like a dozen, all of whom who pled to guilty charges and trying to get plea deals, that brought the reform movement and the situation in the UAW to a head. And then when the federal judge provided an avenue for rank and file workers to decide to change their constitution by having a direct one member, one vote versus the system that the former leadership was able to corrupt through the convention system, 10% of the workers voted on the referendum, a 2-1. They said, we want to change direction. We want to be able to vote for our leadership. That came through. A slate was assembled, and they ran for half of the positions on the international board, and each one of them in their own elections won those elections. Not one lost. So, and clearly the UAW members that were voting weren't that familiar with the people that were voting for, but they knew what they didn't want anymore. And so with the new leadership, and the president just got installed, like barely 6 months ago, all of a sudden they had to flip and get into national negotiations with the big three, which was, I thought, an incredible tall order. And part of what enabled all this to go on were the fact that there was a reform movement that went back to even before New Directions, but New Directions really stands out as a last massive effort to reform the UAW in the decade of 2010 to 2020, right at the time of the bailout and the financial crisis, the Wall Street financial crisis. We had a formation of the Auto Worker Caravan that kept the reform struggle alive and expanded on it in some ways. And now we have the Unite All Workers for Democracy. So there was these evolutions of these various formations, and the UAWD was able to do the kind of organizing that was stepped up to the plate and were able to get these reform candidates elected. And now we have a completely different circumstance with these negotiations, and we have Shawn Fain communicating on a routine basis to the UAW members at large through live stream and social media. And it's clearly sparked an awakening in the rank and file, especially with this class struggle approach, talking about this is about the working class. It isn't just about UAW members, and we're taking on the billionaires. So with that message and the methodology of using social media to reach out to thousands and tens of thousands of UAW members, that's a hell of a remarkable change. And I think that there are a lot of people that have been excited, and they're releasing their frustrations. They're going out on the picket lines, and they've been mobilized. And that's very refreshing. And I think that's having an impact well beyond the UAW. Had a conversation with a Kroger worker, a young Kroger worker, and he's describing that, at Kroger's, we have 3 tiers. I didn't know that. And he described a moment in the break area at Kroger's, and it just happens that that's when Shawn Fain was on TV, and he was taking the Stellantis offer and dumping it into a trash can, and the workers there in the rest area were whooping and hollering and slapping on the table. So it's clearly energizing workers, and they're realizing, we're being had, and it's time to fight and organize and fight back. And that's what I think what we're witnessing. Never mind that this in the context of strikes that have preceded the UAW strike with the big three. I mean, we had strikes at John Deere, we had strikes at Volvo, and so on. So this is part of a wave, and the UAW, I think, with the big three, is accelerating it.
Frank, you mentioned that the new democratic methods that have been won by the membership in the UAW, what kind of influence did the Teamsters, in your view, did the Teamsters activity this summer, as well as in particular, really the young workers that are on the move around the country in their 20s and 30s, and a resurgence of labor with younger workers over the last maybe year and a half or so, but especially this summer, have on the strike, in your opinion?
So, well, I want to say that certainly with the UAWD was very influenced by the work done by TDU. And we've had TDU organizers sharing the model of what they did with the UAW activists. So I think there was definitely an impact. And I think that the kind of activity that was done with the Teamsters at UPS with practice striking and other kind of different kinds of mobilizations became models and examples for what UAW members could do, and UAWD was kind of ahead of the game and beginning to do that, and they did that with a administration, a new leadership that was encouraging that. And so I think that the Teamsters at UPS sort of helped set up a model, and there was interaction. I mean, we had UAW members joining the Teamsters practice picket lines during the negotiations between the Teamsters and UPS. So I think there was a lot of crossover, and there's probably more crossover than I was aware of.
So I guess the other, going back to your position on the international question in terms of workers oriented to an international worker perspective, just like to dig into that a little bit in terms of your role in a lot of different ways over the course of your actions that you participated in, as well as roles you've had. We've noticed that a foundational element of that is fighting the slogans that we oftentimes have talked about here on the show in terms of so quote unquote buy American, and how deadly that chauvinism can be instead of uniting with workers around the world, number one. And number two, really the centrality of supporting and developing in a variety of different ways the development and leadership of historically marginalized or oppressed communities, especially in Detroit, like Black workers. And there's, of course, been a long legacy of that with at the point of production with drum and other kinds of formations over the years. But in today's developments, are you seeing this happen? And why is it so important, in your view, to consistently fighting against these types of unfortunate lines of that do not are not about unity, are about infecting workers with unfortunate sicknesses such as either racism or anti-women comments and things like that, and really developing various different elements of labor and forces in labor. And one of the things also, lastly, that we're seeing with a lot of different strikes and struggles and all kinds of formations is the role of women, from Sarah Nelson with the flight attendants in not just rank and file roles, but leadership roles. So I know that's a lot of items there in one kind of a question, but do you have any response to that?
Yeah, let me just say that, first of all, talking about Detroit. So I live in Detroit. I've lived in Detroit for, like 40 years. And I've been, as long with that work in the labor movement, I've been very active in the various movements, and I call them like pro-democracy movement in Detroit. So I've, in a certain kind of way, I look to weave the community struggle and worker struggle as, interrelated, inseparable forms of struggle. And of course, here in Detroit, we're, 85% majority Black city. So a lot of the issues that confront the city have all to do with national oppression and fighting against that in tandem with worker struggle, and seeing the duality of those struggles. And I was very much, in my development, inspired by the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the work that they did in the late 60s and early 70s. And they also had a model of worker, in-plant organizing, along with organizing a broad united front of high school students and in the community. It was a very much integrated form of multifaceted struggle. And I've tried to, emulate that in various ways. So in regards to so in the UAW, on the other hand, it's unfortunately under the team concept, the team jointness, corrupt kind of unionism. They promoted nationalism, and a nationalism that pit Mexican workers against U.S. workers and vice versa. And it was evident as recently as last Friday. And one of the spokesmen at a rally for the UAW was describing that we should not buy products from Mexico because they're junk. And I took him on and said, no, they're not junk. In fact, it's established that some of the plants that GM and Ford and all them have are actually producing product that might even be better quality than what's produced here. We ought not describe it as junk, and it's really casting an aspersion on the workers, and it's really a disservice to the solidarity that we need to build across the border. And I want to say that toward that end, one of the ways that we can break this down is that in the meantime, it's not like Mexican workers are just accepting their oppression and their exploitation. They're fighting back as well. And one of the ways, is to tell the stories so that workers here understand that we have fighting brothers and sisters that we can unite with. And most recently, that occurred at the GM plant, truck plant in Silao, Mexico, where workers took on the company and refused overtime and fought speed up in solidarity with the strike that was going on at GM here in the US. And 5 of them got fired for it. And of course, workers, while they were on strike, had no clue that this had gone on because there were no links and no chain that brought that to light for GM workers here to know about. But we recently brought to Detroit one of the workers that was the leader of that action in 2019 and had them meet with workers on the picket lines and had them had him speak in one of the union halls at a regular union meeting, and met with Shawn Fain. And so we need to break that down and say we have a common struggle, we have a common enemy, and the nationalism has got to go because we have far more than common, and the only thing that separates us is our language, and we'll overcome that, especially with all the new technology that enables us to do that. So that's an example. There's other examples, and what I'll point to is so there's another aspect to my internationalism that I need to explain, and that has to do with the fact that my brother and I fell on 2 sides of the labor movement in our earlier years as we were growing up and coming out of college. And he became part of the American Institute for Free Labor Development, which is an arm and an instrument of the AFL-CIO in foreign affairs in Latin America. And my brother served for many years, and especially in the country of El Salvador, which is where he was assassinated by the right wing, even for engaging in some minor level of reform, which was designed to tamp down the revolutionary movements in El Salvador. And he lost his life for that. And I know that the role of the AFL-CIO in foreign affairs is extremely problematic. It's funded by the US government. It's funded by something called the National Endowment for Democracy. So part of what inspires me is knowing that we need a different labor establishment in the US that will not interfere with the kind of solidarity and mass struggle that we need to really take on, the Anacondas of the world, the Grace Shipping of the world, the GMs of the world, and that the AFL-CIO more often than not has interfered with that, especially with something like A-Field. So that's partly what informs me. And the reason I brought all that up is that a UAW brother by the name of Rob McKenzie was engaged in solidarity work in his plant at Ford in St. Paul, Minnesota, back in 1990. And he was part of a solidarity effort with militant workers that worked at a Ford plant there. And long story short, the Ford militants in that struggle, which included an occupation of their factory, was invaded by 300 goons dressed in Ford uniforms that went into the plant to crush that struggle, shot 9 workers, killed one of them. And when he retired, my brother Bob McKenzie, he went back and researched precisely what was it that went down, what happened, what was the role of the various, the CTM, the corrupt unions in Mexico, what was the role of the AFL-CIO. And he wrote a book about it, which I think is very important for people to read. El Golpe, the U.S. labor, the CIA, and the coup at Ford in Mexico. And it's through that kind of education and about the solidarity effort that went on at that Ford plant. And just to give you an example, when that worker was killed in Ford in Mexico, he told me the whole first shift of workers in his plant all were wearing armbands in solidarity with the worker that was killed. That's the level of solidarity that we're looking for. Mass rank and file, internationalism. And it was a very good example. And I urge anybody who has not seen that book to get a hold of it. And it's a real eye opener in regards to what's possible with international solidarity and understanding the labor struggle in Mexico, from 1990 to now.
Hey, Frank, we like to try to offer tools to the folks who listen in to the podcast. And some of those folks are younger workers who are just new to the labor movement. Yeah. And I've been holding on to a question, but I don't want to let it go. Earlier on in the show, you mentioned caucuses. So I was hoping that at a very basic level, for someone who may be new to the labor movement, what is the function of a caucus in a union? What can you do there? What has been your experience? If you could just speak to caucuses a little bit, please. Thank you.
Right. So when I was at GM it was in Warren, Michigan, I with just a couple of other workers who were of like mind, and this was back in the late 70s, began to do some agitation and began to talk about, is this a good contract? This was in 1979, or isn't it? And we began to do some education and some leaflets and so on. And that was the beginnings of the building of this caucus that we had for 5 years. And in that 5 years, we built a very democratic caucus. And that is, we began to bring workers into the caucus who collectively could publish a newsletter. Today, we would be doing it all on the internet. But we would be, doing paste-on letters and typing articles and distributing the articles and building a network of people who were interested in our point of view and what we had to say. And we were trying to reflect the struggles of what was going on in and out of the plant. And in the course of doing that, we actually began to attract and draw other workers to our cause. And the role that the caucus played was to advance a different kind of unionism in my plant. In my plant, it was heavy nepotism, heavy, go along to get along kind of thing. And we built a caucus that says we can be a democratic institution and we can struggle for the things that we need, both internally within the union, within the plant and beyond, and do education. And we had social events. We initiated annual Christmas parties because we had 2,000 people that at one point got laid off. And as the layoff dragged down year after year, it got really rough for the laid off workers. And we brought them together and their families and began to do this unbelievable Christmas party that became, it was extraordinary in terms of how it built solidarity. So there were picnics and so on. So there was a variety of ways that we built collectively, and by so doing, we built power. And by the fifth year, when we had local union elections, we were able to elect some of the people that had been playing this kind of leadership role into positions of power in the local. And I think that if a reform movement is worth its salt, it has to be able to build local power. And that is where there's a weakness in the current reform movement, because they made changes nationally, which we were not able to do. But it needs to look at how do you build that kind of power and education and struggle, in particular, in my case, in my local. So it was a multifaceted kind of role that we played. And through our support of, individual workers who had their issues, who were neglected, who were not being represented, all the way to the big issues about, we took people to the last Labor Solidarity March that we had in Washington, D.C., which was in 1992, I think, or maybe 82. But anyway, so it was micro and macro, and that was the work of our caucus.
Well, speaking of the Solidarity Day rally, I want to thank you, Frank, for helping us last December. We had a Solidarity Day for the UAW Local 180 in Racine at Case. About 700 workers. They were on strike for over 9 months, but we interviewed the president there last fall, and the courageous and brave workers there decided to join together and have a Solidarity Day. And it was a wonderful event. We had workers from all over the state of Wisconsin and the region and the Midwest, and thanks for your help for helping organize that. And that was patterned on that Solidarity Day. We incorporated music and cultural elements to it, and really took the approach of that Solidarity Day you mentioned. And we're happy to report that it was a resounding success. We went through the city. We had protests and rallies all day long. For a few days prior, we had political education inside of the UAW, building signs, music and cultural events. So just wanted to ask you about that as well. We talk a lot about on this show, and we always have music here, about the role of music and culture in workers' movements, both here in the U.S. and the experiences that you've had elsewhere, and how foundational and important they can be. Can you expand on that, Frank?
Yeah, and I will. But as you were saying, you were talking about that. I realized that you raised an important question earlier that I didn't quite answer, and let me try to answer it now. One of the fundamentals of the work that we did in my plant was that we didn't countenance racism at all. We were a diverse caucus. We were a caucus of black and white workers, men and women, and we made it we were very clear and intolerant of expressions of racism, racist practices on the part of management, and our approach was that, especially in the capacity of white workers, that we had a special role to play because of just the basic nature of discrimination. Women didn't enter my plant until just a few years before I hired in. It was an all-male plant, and women were a minority. I mean, there were 500 women out of about 3,500 workers, and how to weave that struggle and champion the role of women. So to give you an example of one of the ways we did that is we had a lot of contact at that time with Flint sit-downers, the pioneers of our union, who were holding reunions in Flint, honoring their incredible earth-shaking struggle in the occupation of their GM plants in Flint. And among them were, of course, the women from the Women's Emergency Brigade. And we brought workers to the reunions, and we brought one of the leaders of the Women's Emergency Brigade to our local, and to be present with the Women's Committee, and to be present at our union meeting, to give workers a flavor of what a critical role women played in the struggle to win the union from the get-go. And it's a lesson that's still underrepresented and needs to be carried out. And it's the same is true with the role of the League of Revolutionary Black Struggle and other workers or League of Revolutionary Black Workers, sorry, in showing that oppressed peoples, in some ways, help lead our struggles, and we, in our capacity, need to unite and form a united front of all workers, with a particular understanding of the role of historic discrimination and oppression of women, Black workers, Latino workers, Arabic workers, Asian workers, and so on. So I don't think you could do the kind of work that we need to do without that being in the forefront of everything that we that we do. That it's not a separate thing. It's an integrated part of the work that we do as organizers. So you talked about music and culture, right?
Yep.
So one of the things that we did in our plant is it's amazing when you get to really know about workers' lives, to learn how talented they are and what incredible things they bring to the game. And one of the ways is that a lot of workers, on their own lives, are musicians. And there was a big open house. It was, I think, a GM 75th anniversary. And, they created a stage for all this talent to emerge and to be, and for workers to appreciate each other and the many faceted ways that they're talented. And then you bring to that the labor culture that's been, comes out through, music and bands and so on, and also through incredibly historic movies that represent working class people. And that's a very popular way to, educate workers in a form of entertainment that really brings home the lessons. I think every worker knows about the film Norma Ray, which is, one of those rare movements that shows working class struggle in a southern textile plant, or Harlan County, and having film showing of that nature is another way of elevating working class culture and working class struggle. And it's a very popular form of doing that. We honored the Flint sit-down strikes at my local in 2019, in the lead up actually to the GM strike. And, one of the most popular features of it was that we had musicians that, led the whole crowd in singing Solidarity Forever. So that there's just a lot of ways that you can reach people's consciousness. It isn't always through, big tomes or big books or lengthy leaflets. There's other ways to do it as well.
To today, Frank, what's happening on the picket lines? Can you describe your latest experience? What's going on at some of the picket lines in Detroit? And then how can listeners and others support the strike immediately right now? We know we just talked about how some folks who have never been involved in a labor movement or never been involved in a strike before, that once you step foot outside the doors of your workplace, you might never go back in again. You're putting potentially at risk, a variety of things, including your home. And it's a very courageous and brave thing to do. So can you describe the conditions on the strike and the picket line, some of your experiences, and how that's going where you're at? And then nationally, how we can help support the courageous UAW strikers at the Big Three right now.
Yeah, and I do want to add, by the way, that the work that you did on behalf of UAW Local 180, I thought was a great example, and there are examples like that. That I'm going to give you a shout out. I thought that was incredible work. It inspired my retirees chapter, which, by the way, is all that's left of my local today. They wanted to donate a whole lot of money, man, because they were inspired by what they understood and saw that was going on in the Solidarity campaign. on behalf of those workers. So I wanted to add that. So there's many forms. There was a national call for pickets or I shouldn't say, kind of like demos, for the lack of another word, at auto dealerships last Saturday, yesterday. And as it turns out, my daughter lives in upstate New York with her husband, and they went to a dealership with the UAW signs. And apparently that happened in various other locations. So I know that there's a network out there that's mobilized that kind of solidarity in places where there haven't been picket lines. And, I think that's tremendous. Locally, there's, people, there's a lot of, you can find out about strike locations, I think, from the UAW website. There are many now that when they open up the strike or spread the strike to more parts warehouses in various parts of the country, workers have been showing up on the picket lines. They've been bringing, all kinds of daily life necessities, things to eat, food, water. They've been bringing firewood. Moratorium Now here in Detroit has been gathering, firewood and bringing it to sites because it just got real chilly here, and it probably got chilly where you are. And it's going to be 40 tonight, and the picketers are beginning to picket not in 80-degree weather. So that kind of material support is phenomenal. I think that probably letters to mass media in support of the strike. My brother sent me a letter that he had submitted to the Toledo Blade that got published, UAW retiree. I know that my retirees chapter had organized food to bring to the strikers. Doing what we're doing here. There are so many ways, but you can find out the locations by going on to the UAW website. And the other thing is, I would urge people that want to know what's going on to go to the UAW International Union Facebook page, which is where Shawn Fain has been making all these communications, and you will be up to date on what's going on with the struggle. He did that again last Friday when he announced this a new agreement, with GM over battery plants. And the other thing I want to add in this context is something that's very critically important. The day before the strike began, maybe it was September 13th or 14th, there was a little action here in advance of the auto show, and the action was initiated by environmental groups. And it turns out that 100 organizations of various stripes, including the likes of Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, the Sunrise Movement, and so on, galvanized together letters that they sent to the CEOs of the big three, expressing full solidarity with the UAW on the question of what they call just transition, which is workers cannot be left out of the transition that's being engineered from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, which is what the big three want to do. They want to bring them in at $16 an hour, as they did in Ohio. And the UAW is saying, if we're going to have support for making that transition in the face of the climate crisis, workers got to be equal partners, and their needs have to be met as well, and it can't be done at their expense. So anyway, this group of organizations that mobilize in support of the UAW are not only supporting the UAW because the UAW is talking about just transition, but they're supporting the UAW on opposing two tiers and so on some of the other demands. And I thought that was an exemplary way to build solidarity. And I would say the document appears on the website Public Citizen that was sent to the CEOs. And I would say, man, I'd knock on the door in any one of these environmental organizations and say, y'all want to organize some kind of support for the UAW members? I'm in. But they took the lead. And I don't think the UAW has done enough to make that visible and to get that out there. But there are organizations that are saying, we stand with the UAW, and we can connect with those organizations and make that more of a robust effort.
Okay, Frank, thank you. Gonna start to wrap it up now, but wanted to get one more question in. And this is a general question. As I mentioned already, a lot of new workers getting involved in the labor movement, a lot of young workers getting involved in the labor movement. So the first part of my question is, any advice for them, any guiding lights for them, any nuggets of wisdom that you would like to share? And I guess that also connected to my second question was there, you already mentioned that your long history of labor activism. Any tactic in particular that you would like to highlight for the sake of someone who's new to the labor movement that was particularly effective?
Wow.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. It seems to me, and I'm kind of like talking about what I've seen the UAWD doing, and I think that they've been effective because what they've done, they've used tactics that are popular. And if there's anything else that you want to be, is you want to be popular. And so, they've had this whole campaign of wearing red T-shirts on Wednesday. A lot of people can do that. They've had the campaign. They've had efforts where they do 10-minute conversation at work, and all they're saying is, let's have a 10-minute conversation, and then do whatever we got to do. But they're bringing people in a way that's not alienating, it's welcoming. And I haven't been, directly involved in that, but I got to say, it really feels like it kind of works. And it's through that and breaking down any kind of barriers that you may have that it becomes easy to begin to, and I think to me, what I learned in my organizing life is you got to be a good listener. There's no way in the world that I could have done any of the work that I did if I didn't develop the capacity to listen. And people have remarked about that about me over the years, that, you're always a good listener. And I think that we may have this message that we want to get across, and we want to organize inside it. But if you're not capable of listening where people are coming from, and what their angst is, and what their complaints are, they're going to feel like, oh, this is just one other. They're ignoring me. They're really not recognizing me. They're not really seeing me. They're not going to respond. So you got to see them. And I think that's that would be my advice. You got to really see the people that you're looking at and saying, there's a better way. We need to organize together, and we need to do it in the way that we educate ourselves. But we got to be good listeners. That's what I would say.
Thank you. No, that's a lot. Those are some golden nuggets right there. Yeah, popularize things and listen to the people. I think that's solid. Well,
Great.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's been a real pleasure talking to you tonight. Seriously, learned a lot right here. And thank you to the listeners for listening. Again, love and solidarity to all. We will come back to you next week on We Rise Fighting Labor Podcast. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.